Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are heading to the Andes Mountains. Now, visually, it's a place of absolutely staggering natural beauty, with peaks reaching thousands of meters into the sky. But historically, this vast mountain range has actually been the dramatic backdrop for two intensely contrasting extremes of the human condition. On one hand, you have the absolute peak of human resilience and the will to live. And on the other, you have the deepest, darkest abyss of human depravity. Okay, let's dive right into this comparison, because the juxtaposition is completely jarring. On one side, you have the famous 1972 crash of Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571. This is where a rugby team crashes in the freezing, totally unforgiving high Andes. Against literally all odds, surviving avalanches and sub-zero temperatures, 16 young men endure 72 days on the mountain through sheer teamwork. It's a defining story of human triumph. But consider the flip side. Just a few years later, roaming the valleys and foothills of these very same mountains was a man named Pedro López. His story is the exact inverse of that heroism. It's this terrifying reality of undetected predation, darkness, and huge systemic failure. Today, we're focusing on how the shadow of these mountains hid one of history's most horrific secrets. Section 1. The Monster's Asalcaherney. To even begin to understand how someone can operate completely under the radar across international borders, we've got to look at his timeline. Let's walk through this together. In 1969, Lopez gets sentenced to 7 years in a Colombian prison for auto theft. While he's in there, he's assaulted by fellow inmates, and in retaliation, he commits his first murders, killing 3 of his attackers. Because of that, his sentence is briefly extended. But in 1978, he's released back into society. And you guys, this is when the true nightmare begins. He immediately starts wandering the borders of Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador. In just 2 short years, between his release in '78 and his eventual arrest in Ecuador in 1980, his reign of terror escalated to a level that is, frankly, almost impossible to comprehend. I just want to let this devastating number sink in for a second. 300. That is the estimated number of victims he claimed across those 3 countries in a span of just a couple of years. It's the kind of figure that completely paralyzes investigations and absolutely shatters communities. So you're probably wondering, how on earth did he reach such a staggering number without getting caught? Well, he was incredibly methodical about who he targeted. He specifically hunted down the most vulnerable, unprotected members of society. We're talking preteen girls, usually between the ages of 8 and 13. He specifically looked for children who were out working alone as street vendors in incredibly busy markets, or kids from marginalized indigenous tribes. Basically, he preyed on those whose disappearances might tragically be overlooked or initially dismissed by authorities as runaways or human trafficking victims. So the crucial point here is how he actually operated, right out in broad daylight. His modus operandi came down to 3 chilling steps. First, he'd position himself in chaotic, busy public spaces like Plaza Urbina in Ecuador. He'd just blend right in, sometimes even pretending to be a fellow vendor. Second, he'd lure these young, impoverished girls away by offering a tiny amount of money, usually just 100 sucre coin, or he'd ask for directions to a bus stop. And third, once he had isolated them away from the crowds and into secluded, abandoned areas, he would attack. He literally used the chaos of public life as his hunting ground. Section 2. Taftish or Nishanat. For years, the police largely believed all these missing girls were victims of a trafficking ring. But let's explore exactly how this monster was finally tracked down. You might expect some brilliant detective work here, but actually, it was nature's intervention. In April of 1980, severe flash flooding hit the areas around Ambato, Ecuador. The floodwaters morbidly washed away the topsoil, unearthing the hidden remains of 4 young girls. Crucially, local police noted that the bodies bore clear signs of manual strangulation. This horrific discovery forced the authorities to immediately shift their working theory. They realized, no, we aren't looking for a trafficking cartel. We are hunting a highly active serial killer. And just days after those floods, the capture finally happened. But it wasn't a massive police sting. It was entirely due to the bravery of the local community. Step 1. Lopez was back at the market, attempting to lure away 12-year-old Marina Roman Pavetta. Step 2. Her mom, Carolina, who happened to be a merchant board president and had seen him acting suspiciously before, recognized him instantly. She grabbed him, screamed, and refused to let go, accusing him of trying to take her daughter and linking him to the recent bodies found. Step 3. A crowd of local market vendors rushed over, overpowered López, and physically detained him until the authorities arrived. Talk about community vigilance. Once in custody, López totally clammed up. He refused to speak. So, police got creative and placed him in a cell with an undercover police captain posing as a fellow prisoner. Over the course of 27 days, this captain patiently built a rapport with him, and López, chillingly proud of what he'd done, actually began to boast. He confessed to over 300 murders. Eventually, he agreed to show police the evidence, which led investigators straight to a mass grave in a forest near Ambato, where the remains of 53 girls were recovered. Suddenly, the sheer, unimaginable scale of his confession was undeniably real.
Section 3. Mujram ka zia.
I want to slow our pacing down here for just a moment to do a brief psychological deep dive into the mind of this killer. And please be warned, the details on these next few slides are incredibly chilling. When asked to explain the motive behind his atrocities, López offered this terrifying, twisted rationale. Quote, "I lost my innocence at age of 8, so I decided to do the same to as many girls as I could." That was his primary stated motivation, just a vicious, calculated cycle of projecting his own trauma onto the most defenseless people he could find. And this brilliantly illustrates the tragic psychological origins detailed in the source material. Before López was even born, his father was murdered. By age 8, after some inappropriate behavior, he was totally banished from his mother's home. He lived as a homeless street child in Bogotá, enduring severe abuse, sexual assaults, and desperate malnutrition. Now, to be absolutely crystal clear here, millions of people suffer horrific trauma and never harm us all. This background never ever excuses his crimes, but from a purely investigative standpoint, it maps out exactly how these deep-seated sociopathic tendencies were formed on the streets. What's perhaps most disturbing of all, though, is his complete lack of remorse. He casually explained to interviewers that he killed strictly for pleasure. He insisted on strangling his victims manually so they would remain conscious, as he coldly described it, until the lights in their eyes go out. He found the whole act completely thrilling. He even told police that he would occasionally dig up the bodies he had buried just to have tea parties with the deceased. Section 4. The Ackery Shock. Now prepare yourself for the final twist of this explainer. The crimes themselves are horrifying enough, obviously, but what private investigators and legal records reveal about the aftermath, it's a completely different kind of shock. 16. That was the absolute maximum prison sentence available under Ecuadorian law at the time of his trial. So let that sink in. Despite openly confessing to over 300 murders and being officially convicted of 57 counts of murder based on the recovered bodies, Pedro López was sentenced to just 16 years behind bars. Notice the stark, absurd contrast here. On the left, expected justice. A man responsible for hundreds of deaths spends the rest of his natural life locked away. On the right, the staggering reality. Pedro López was released in 1994. He served just 14 years of his 16-year sentence and was let out early for good behavior. Upon his release, he boldly and sickeningly called himself the man of the century. It's a jarring, monumental systemic failure. So how did the system fail so spectacularly? Basically, it was a domino effect of legal loopholes and jurisdictional red tape. Upon his release from Ecuador, he was deported back to his native Colombia. But because Colombia had no official active warrants for him at that exact moment, they could only hold him briefly on an old, unproven charge. They placed him in a psych ward for observation. Then, by 1998, he was shockingly declared legally sane by a medical professional, and the courts released him on a bail equivalent to just $70. $70. And unsurprisingly, he absconded immediately. He simply vanished. Despite a 2002 Interpol warrant being issued when a new murder perfectly matched his exact modus operandi, and despite private investigators loudly warning the public of his incredibly high risk to reoffend, Pedro López, the monster of the Andes, was never recaptured. As of today, his whereabouts remain completely unknown. Which brings us to a deeply unsettling reality, and the question I want to leave you with today. If a man who openly confessed to over 300 murders across 3 separate countries can just navigate legal loopholes, serve less than 15 years, and ultimately walk completely free on a $70 bail, what does that say about the safety and efficacy of our global justice system? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning what you see.